Greetings, Tubaneros. So, all is alarm and anger because someone other than the USA has invaded the organic sanctity of a sovereign nation state, namely the penetration of Ukraine's Netherlands by the phalanx of the Russian armed forces. This has been taken as personally as if Putin rammed a dildo up the anus of the whole Western world and its leaders. Aside from the satisfying chuckle such imagery produces, let's analyze the source of this attitude. First of all, I'm not going to take the part of Russia today and justify the legality of the Russian move because there really isn't any. Just as there was no legality in the pogromists in Kiev, setting bonfires in the streets, torching buildings, drawing swastikas on them, and finally driving the legally elected president out of the country because they couldn't wait for the legal limit of his term to legally expire. Just as there was no legality in the U.S. bombing and invading Serbia to detach Kosovo, occupied, then set it up as an independent country, though this was desired by its majority, just as there was no legality in depriving Iraq of its sovereign airspace to assert a no-fly zone over Kurdistan, equally desired by its majority residents. So, legality is not an international issue we need bother with, is it? The Ukraine is a borderland. Its name signifies this in Slav speak to the interior of the Russias, which once existed in multiple form, not just Moscovia. Its natural riches have long been coveted by the West, from the Kaiser to Churchill to Hitler and now to the NATO empire. Detaching it from Russia has been the wet dream of Western geopolitics for over a century. NATO was not the first Western force sending its light brigades charging over the Crimean flatlands. Making common cause with aspiring local politicians is also old news. After World War I, an opportunistic claque of independence leaders gained home rule on the Kaiser's helmet spike, only to be driven from power as their puppet regime collapsed. During the Russian Civil War, Sebastopol and the Crimea were occupied by French and British forces to aid local freedom fighters of the White Russian Army, a script that they are ill-advised to repeat in the nuclear age. But memories are long on both sides of the Kerch Peninsula. Unforgotten also is how the West Ukraine nationalist movement replayed its role of useful fool in Hitler's invasion, once again falling for promises of anti-Russian freedom if only they would help the liberator of the Western world annihilate the Jews of the old Pale of Settlement. Ukrainian nationalists in West Ukraine added a second genocide all on their own, that of ethnic Poles, to ensure that no matter the outcome of the war, Ukraine would remain Ukrainian and there could be no reason to ever return their region or any part of it back to Poland. Now the West stands poised to fulfill this long-cherished dream, to absorb the black soil sunflower fields and coal mines of the Ukraine into the ravenous guts of the European Union, digest them through privatization, and move NATO's military might right into Muscovy's face. Only, they're not dealing with a pipsqueak that has to swallow insult and injury, like the usual Western target. Russia is not Serbia, Putin is not Saddam Hussein. He can hit back, and thus the Western world cries foul because its dictates are met with pushback. But, Azov, the Ukrainian people didn't want Putin's puppet pulling their strings. They threw him out into redeeming their identity in the wing of Western freedom. Only this is the same song and dance we've heard and seen before. Defining who and what exactly are the Ukrainian people has again been left to self-selected xenophobes who decide that the people are themselves alone, while they hawk the house to the bank for the sensation of ownership. Much like a low-income American signing the dotted line on a house he knows he can't afford, but must have to feel like he's a real middle-class citizen. And so we're at the present crisis. Deposing the president via coup and street pogrom created a legal vacuum, which was filled at the other end by the Russian army. The state which had signed non-nuclear treaties with Moscow in 1994 was gone. There is thus the real possibility of NATO now entering Ukraine over the heads of most of its people, those real Ukrainian people, the real people that live in the Ukraine, who prefer non-alignment. That will mean nuclear weaponry returning to Ukraine, and to the Crimea specifically. Russia will not let its warm water fleet be bottled up by NATO as the Crimea is turned into a NATO lake by both Ukraine and Turkey. Russia instead set out to recover its lost rights in the Black Sea, and unless the West can cajole the candy out of Putin's hands, which is unlikely, the Western world is going to have to face someone telling it no to its face, for the first time in decades. So this is just another chicken coming home to the Western roost. Again, to use a recent enough example the world hasn't had time enough to completely forget, In February 2008, the West recognized the independence of its colonial occupation government in Kosovo after first invading Serbia and detaching said province to protect its people from the xenophobes of Belgrade. Because the operating principle here was the supremacy of human rights, correct? Supposedly, and the enforcing of them over the sovereign territorial rights of nation-states. So Kosovo became a military base for NATO, and America became our big daddy, as a young Kosovar immigrant once said to me. On that happy occasion, Putin spoke thusly at the summit of the Commonwealth of Independent States, that the Kosovo precedent is a terrifying one, that in essence it is breaking open the entire system of international relations that has prevailed not just for decades, but for centuries, and it will without a doubt bring on itself an entire chain of unforeseen consequences. So we have Putin as the upholder of traditional Westphalian international border law, traditional international relations against the West discarding of such sovereignty in the New World Order. In that audience was the future pro-NATO president of Georgia, Mike Saakashvili, who also said of the Kosovo move, "This is a stick with two ends, and that other end will come back and knock them on the head one day." At the very next NATO summit that April, both Ukraine and Georgia were promised NATO membership. No time was given, and it depends on the government's willingness to ask and the convenience of NATO to grant it, but it's always been assumed by Western leaders that it was a fruit ready to fall into their hands, much like Cuba in the days of the Monroe Doctrine. And so the time seems to have come, and with it the other end of that stick. NATO membership is not offered to states with so-called unresolved internal conflicts, and in this preventive move, Putin made a check, if not checkmate, to the NATO game board by creating such an issue, thus outing NATO membership on hold, or agreeing to NATO membership with Russia in possession of its greatest strategic prize, the Crimean Peninsula. But in another respect, history disagrees with Putin. The consequences were not unforeseen. The present breakdown of international relations in the East is exactly what the West has long desired. While the West rants and raves about resurgent Russian imperialism, its leaders know full well that the former USSR was a gilded cage for Russia, much like NATO is for Germany, keeping traditional Russian nationalism and expansionism in check through a multinational state with a common ideology. Cracking open that cage also freed Russia to return to its own native traditions of autocracy, orthodoxy, and great Russia one and indivisible. Hence the desire to find a new cage, a new iron curtain security fence to keep Russia hemmed in like the wrong side of Detroit. The West has sought to back Russia into a corner, and in so doing has backed itself into one. The Crimean crisis is thus one of the West's co-creation. The West first destroyed the security belt of the USSR that kept these old squabbles confined to the history books, and the West destroyed the internal sanctity of post-war nation-state borders, the way G8 member states really behave, giving the lie to Secretary John Kerry's do as we say, not as we do posturing. The West first made commitments against NATO expansion to Russia's borders, then broke them with the unblinking finesse of a 19th century Indian treaty. How? Because the government that co-signed the treaty, the USSR, ceased to exist, just as the government that co-signed post-Soviet military arrangements with Russia ceased to exist last February, obviously removing all residual legal and moral claims, right? And now we're in the worst security crisis since the end of the Cold War. Really? You mean the war on terror has been just a sideshow after all? Not the existential threat that necessitated 2 invasions and occupations or the gutting of the U.S. Bill of Rights? Well, thank you, U.S. government, for finally admitting it, albeit in the usual indirect, dishonest manner. They sure as hell forgot about Iran real quick. And while we're at it, thought it was time to hear the YouTube line. Howdy. Who is it? Saddam Hussein. You and Slobodan Milosevic and Muammar Gaddafi were sitting around playing Parcheesi and heard me mention your names. And you want to tell our viewers that you're making room for Vladimir Putin to come down there and join your coffee club? Well, that's not going to happen, boys. First, Putin hasn't actually killed anyone. They're trying to put the Hitler bag on him, but so far no genocide, not even a scratch or two. And most important, the West itself will actually get hurt this time if it tries enforcing its Sunday go-to-meeting rules on someone else. Rules are always made just for little guys like you, and to be broken by those who make them.